My name is Natalie Brooks, and I learned something important the day my family laughed at me in that glass tower overlooking Lake Michigan. I learned that sometimes the people who share your blood are the last ones to see your heart. For 5 years, I'd been the ghost at family gatherings, the one they whispered about in hallways, the daughter who walked away from a six-figure salary at Morrison and Fletcher to work with kids who couldn't afford lunch. They called it my phase, my breakdown, my colossal mistake. But standing in that conference room on the 42nd floor of Sullivan Associates, watching my cousin Ryan smirk as the attorney handed me a single tarnished key, I realized my grandmother had seen something they never could. She'd seen me choose people over profit, compassion over corner offices, and somehow in her quiet way she'd been keeping score. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The key felt light in my palm, almost weightless, like a joke without a punchline. Ryan actually laughed out loud, that bark of amusement he'd perfected in business school. Victoria, my aunt, hid her smile behind a manicured hand, her diamond rings catching the afternoon sunlight that poured through floor-to-ceiling windows. Even Uncle Dennis, who rarely showed emotion beyond irritation, let out a low chuckle and shook his head. A key, a single ordinary key on a plain metal ring. No note, no explanation, just cold brass that probably opened some forgotten storage unit filled with whatever junk my grandmother couldn't bear to throw away. I stood there feeling the heat creep up my neck, that familiar burn of being the family disappointment, the cautionary tale they'd tell at holiday dinners for years to come. I never expected to inherit millions. That wasn't why I showed up that Tuesday morning, fighting traffic from Logan Square to downtown Chicago, parallel parking my 12-year-old sedan between Mercedes and Teslas in the underground garage. I came because Grandma Helen had asked me to, in her own way. 3 weeks before she died, when I visited her at Brooks Manor in Winnetka, she'd held my hand with surprising strength for someone so frail and whispered that she was proud of me. Those 3 words had sustained me through her funeral, through the cold reception where family members offered condolences to everyone except me, through the silent drive home, where I cried in my car before walking up 3 flights of stairs to my tiny apartment that smelled like the Thai restaurant downstairs. I came because she'd made me promise I'd be there when Mr. Sullivan read the will. I came because even though my family had spent half a decade treating me like I'd betrayed some sacred covenant by leaving corporate law, Grandma Helen never did. She'd visit me sometimes at the community center in Pilsen where I worked, showing up unannounced in her town car, her driver waiting patiently outside while she sat with kids doing homework at donated tables. She never made a big deal about it. She'd just appear, ask questions, listen to the teenagers tell her about their dreams of college, their fears about money, their pride in small victories. Then she'd leave as quietly as she'd come, pressing a check into my hand that she'd insist was for supplies, for field trips, for whatever the center needed most. The law firm occupied prime real estate in the Loop, the kind of address that announced wealth before you even stepped inside. The elevator moved so smoothly I barely felt the ascent, just watched the numbers climb until 42 appeared, and the doors whispered open to reveal marble floors and walls lined with dark wood that probably cost more than I made in a year. A receptionist with perfect posture and a practiced smile guided me to the conference room where my family had already gathered, arranged around an oval table like they were posing for a portrait of affluence. Victoria sat nearest to where Mr. Sullivan stood at the head of the table, her posture impeccable, her cream-colored suit probably fresh from some boutique I'd never heard of. She'd always been the picture of Brooks' family sophistication, the one who'd married well, invested wisely and raised children who understood that legacy meant maintaining appearances above all else. Ryan, Her son had claimed the seat to her right, his tailored navy suit and designer watch broadcasting success. He'd inherited more than earned. He worked for Brooks Development Corporation in some executive capacity I'd never quite understood, something involving acquisitions and market expansion that sounded impressive in the abstract, but meant nothing to the families I helped find housing every day. Uncle Dennis had taken the chair across from them, his thick arms crossed over his chest, his expression suggesting he had better places to be. He'd run the construction side of the family business for decades, turning Grandma Helen's vision into steel and concrete, into towers that bore the Brooks name across Chicago's skyline. He'd never forgiven me for leaving Morrison and Fletcher, where I'd spent 3 miserable years drafting contracts and filing motions for clients who measured justice in billable hours. When I'd announced I was taking a position at Pilsen Community Services, he'd actually asked if I was having some kind of mental health crisis. Emma sat at the far end, my younger cousin who'd always existed in the uncomfortable space between family loyalty and personal conscience. She caught my eye when I entered and offered a small smile, genuine but cautious, like she wasn't sure which version of family politics would win out today. I appreciated the effort. In the 5 years since I'd made my choice, she'd been one of the few who still texted occasionally, who asked how I was doing without judgment coloring every word. Mr. Sullivan acknowledged my arrival with a professional nod and gestured to the empty seat beside Emma. I took it, setting my canvas bag on the floor, acutely aware of how different it looked next to the leather briefcases and designer purses surrounding it. The attorney was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd managed the Brooks family affairs for 30 years, silver-haired, measured in his movements, expensive in a way that didn't need to announce itself. He'd known my grandmother since before I was born, had helped her navigate the legal complexities of building an empire from the small real estate company she'd inherited from her own father. He began with the formalities, the legal language that transformed a life into assets and distributions, each sentence carefully constructed to ensure there could be no ambiguity, no room for contest. Grandma Helen's estate was substantial, he explained, built over 6 decades of strategic investments and careful stewardship. The primary asset was Brooks Development Corporation, the family business that had shaped Chicago's luxury real estate market, that had transformed empty lots into soaring residential towers where the wealthy paid premium prices for premium views. Victoria leaned forward slightly, her interest carefully controlled but unmistakable. Ryan's expression shifted into something almost hungry, that particular blend of anticipation and entitlement that comes from growing up believing certain things belong to you by birthright. Even Uncle Dennis uncrossed his arms, his attention sharpening as Mr. Sullivan outlined the scope of what was about to be divided. The attorney continued methodically through smaller bequests. Victoria received Grandma Helen's jewelry collection, pieces that had been photographed.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Photographed for charity galas and society pages that carried history and market value in equal measure. Uncle Dennis inherited her stake in a commercial property near O'Hare, a strip mall that generated steady rental income. Ryan got her collection of first-edition books, a library of leather-bound volumes he'd probably never read but could certainly appraise. Emma received Grandma Helen's vintage Mercedes, the cream-colored sedan she'd driven to garden parties and fundraising luncheons. Each announcement landed with polite acknowledgement, nods of appreciation that barely masked the real question hanging in the room. These were tokens, gestures, the kinds of bequests that demonstrated affection but didn't constitute power. The real inheritance, everyone knew, was Brooks Development Corporation itself, the controlling interest that would determine who led the family business into its next chapter, who held the authority to make decisions about properties worth tens of millions of dollars. Then Mr. Sullivan's gaze shifted to me. For a moment I thought he might skip over my name entirely, that perhaps Grandma Helen had decided it would be easier for everyone if I simply wasn't included. But he reached into his leather portfolio and withdrew a small envelope, the kind you might use for a greeting card, nothing official or imposing. Inside was the key, just sitting there on white paper, no explanation, no context. He slid it across the polished table toward me. The metal made a small scraping sound that seemed louder than it should have been. I stared at it, confused, waiting for him to explain what door it opened, what storage unit or safe deposit box my grandmother had wanted me to access. But he simply moved on, his expression neutral, professional, revealing nothing. That's when Ryan laughed. Not a small chuckle, but a full, genuine laugh that echoed off the glass walls. "A key?" he said, his voice carrying that particular tone people use when they want everyone to share in their amusement. "Helen left her a key? That's perfect. That's actually perfect." Victoria's smile was smaller, more controlled, but no less cutting. "Well," she said, her voice honeyed with false sympathy, "I'm sure it opens something meaningful, perhaps a storage locker." Helen did have trouble letting go of things toward the end. Uncle Dennis shook his head, dismissive, probably full of old furniture and tax documents. "You'll need to sort through it eventually, hire someone to haul it all away. That'll cost you more than whatever's inside is worth." The heat in my cheeks intensified. I picked up the key, closed my fingers around it, felt its edges press into my palm. It wasn't even an interesting key, nothing antique or decorative, just standard brass that could have been cut at any hardware store. Emma looked uncomfortable, her eyes darting between me and her mother, clearly uncertain whether to defend me or maintain the family solidarity that had always been easier than standing alone. I wanted to leave. Every instinct told me to stand up, walk out, let them return to dividing their empire without the uncomfortable presence of the relative who'd chosen wrong. But something kept me in that chair, some echo of Grandma Helen's voice reminding me that she'd asked me to be there, that she'd made me promise. So I stayed, silent, holding a key that felt like a punchline to a joke I didn't understand. Mr. Sullivan continued as if nothing unusual had happened. His voice remained steady, professional, as he outlined the distribution of Brooks Development Corporation itself. The controlling interest, he explained, would be divided among the primary heirs, with Victoria receiving 40%, Uncle Dennis 30%, and Ryan 25%. The remaining 5% would be held in trust for Emma, accessible when she turned 30. The relief in the room was palpable. Victoria actually smiled, genuine this time, satisfaction settling into her features. Ryan leaned back in his chair, already calculating, already planning how he'd leverage his quarter stake into greater influence. Uncle Dennis nodded once, the closest thing to approval I'd ever seen from him. This was what they'd expected, what they'd prepared for, what made sense according to the logic of family hierarchy and business succession. Mr. Sullivan gathered his papers, signaling the official proceedings were complete. Victoria stood first, smoothing her suit, already discussing dinner plans with Ryan, already moving forward into their new reality as the primary controllers of the Brooks empire. Uncle Dennis pulled out his phone, presumably to call his own attorney, to begin the process of understanding exactly what his 30% entitled him to demand and decide. I stood too, picking up my bag, ready to escape before anyone could offer more commentary on my inheritance of a single key. But as I turned toward the door, Mr. Sullivan's voice stopped me. "Miss Brooks," he said quietly, "if you could remain a moment. There's one additional matter your grandmother asked me to address with you privately." The room went still. Victoria paused mid-sentence, turning back to look at the attorney with an expression I couldn't quite read. Ryan's easy confidence flickered, just for a second, replaced by something sharper. Even Uncle Dennis lowered his phone, his attention returning to the head of the table where Mr. Sullivan stood with his hand resting on his leather portfolio. Privately, Victoria's voice carried an edge. "I'm not sure that's necessary, Patrick. We're all family here." Mr. Sullivan's expression didn't change. Nevertheless, Mrs. Ashworth, Helen's instructions were quite specific. "This matter concerns Miss Brooks alone." I watched my aunt's jaw tighten, that subtle clench that meant she was restraining herself from saying something she'd later deny having thought. Ryan looked between his mother and the attorney, clearly waiting for Victoria to assert some kind of authority that would allow them all to stay. But Mr. Sullivan simply waited, patient and immovable, his decades of experience handling difficult clients evident in the way he held his ground without appearing confrontational. Uncle Dennis was the first to move toward the door. "Fine," he muttered, already returning his attention to his phone. "I've got a site inspection in an hour anyway." He left without looking back, his footsteps heavy on the marble floor outside. Victoria gathered her purse with deliberate slowness, making it clear that she was choosing to leave rather than being dismissed. "I'll expect a full briefing later, Natalie," she said, as if I reported to her, as if whatever happened in this room was somehow her business to oversee. Helen may have had her eccentricities toward the end, but family matters should remain transparent. Ryan followed his mother, but not before pausing at the door to look back at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. Curiosity maybe, mixed with something else. Concern that perhaps the family narrative about poor misguided Natalie wasn't quite as complete as they'd believed. Then he was gone, and it was just Emma hesitating near her chair. "Do you want me to wait outside?" she asked, directing the question to me rather than to Mr. Sullivan, which I appreciated. I almost said yes. Having someone there, even just beyond the door, felt like it might make whatever was coming easier to handle. But I shook my head. "It's okay. I'll catch up with you later." She nodded, squeezed my shoulder as she passed, and then I was alone with Mr. Sullivan in that enormous conference room, surrounded by windows that looked out over a city my grandmother had helped shape, that bore her mark in steel and stone across its skyline. The attorney waited until the door clicked shut, until the sound of expensive shoes on marble faded completely. Then he returned to his portfolio, and withdrew a thick envelope, different from the small one that had held the key. This one was cream-colored, heavy paper stock, and sealed with dark blue wax, that bore an impression I recognized immediately. My grandmother's personal seal, the one she used for documents she considered truly important, not the corporate seal of Brooks Development but her own mark, the intertwined initials H and B surrounded by a simple wreath. He placed it on the table in front of the chair at the head, the seat that had remained empty throughout the reading, the position my grandmother would have occupied if she were still here. Then he gestured to it. "Your grandmother requested that you read this here, in this room before taking any other action. She was quite specific about the timing and the setting." I stared at the envelope, not moving. The key in my hand suddenly felt heavier, like it had gained weight from context I didn't yet understand. "What is this?" Mr. Sullivan's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing something that looked almost like compassion. "I've been the Brooks family attorney for 30 years, Natalie. In all that time, I've never seen Helen more certain about anything than she was about this. She spent months preparing, ensuring every detail was exactly as it needed to be. She made me promise I would deliver this to you personally, in this specific way, and that I would give you time to process it before the legal implications became public record." Legal implications. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. I walked slowly to the head of the table, to that chair that seemed too large, too significant for someone who'd spent 5 years being told she'd made herself irrelevant to everything the Brooks family represented. I sat down, feeling the leather against my back, the solid weight of furniture built to last generations. The envelope's wax seal cracked easily under my thumb, the pieces falling onto the polished table like dark blue snow. Inside were pages, several of them, and I recognized my grandmother's handwriting immediately. Not typed, not dictated to some assistant, but written in her own hand, the careful script that had signed birthday cards and thank you notes throughout my entire life. The first line made my throat tighten. My dearest Natalie, if you're reading this, then I've finally managed to pull off the most important act of my life. Forgive an old woman her sense of theater, but some truths need the right staging to be properly understood. I had to pause, close my eyes, breathe through the sudden ache in my chest. This was her voice, unmistakably that blend of affection and dry humor that had always made her different from the rest of the family. I could almost hear her saying these words, could picture her sitting at her desk in the study at Brooks Manor, composing this with the same care she'd applied to every significant decision of her life. I continued reading. By now you've endured another performance of family dynamics at their finest. I imagine Victoria maintained her composure while calculating percentages. Dennis probably checked his phone more than he paid attention, and Ryan, dear Ryan, likely assumed his inheritance was simply confirmation of what he already believed he deserved. I watched them navigate the reading in my mind before I even wrote this, because people are remarkably consistent, especially when money is involved. And you, my brilliant girl, received a key. Just a key. No explanation, no context, nothing to suggest it was anything more than a cruel joke or a sign of an old woman's declining faculties. I suspect they laughed. I suspect you felt small. I'm sorry for that pain, truly I am, but it was necessary. You needed to see them clearly, one final time without the fog of hope or family obligation obscuring the view. My hands were shaking slightly as I turned to the second page. Mr. Sullivan had moved to the windows, giving me privacy while remaining present, a silent witness to whatever transformation this letter was meant to catalyze. You've spent 5 years being brave, Natalie. 5 years choosing purpose over prestige, meaning over money, service over status. Do you have any idea how extraordinary that is? In a family built on the foundation of accumulation, of measuring worth in square footage and market values, you walked away from a career that would have made you wealthy to work with people who society has largely decided don't matter. You chose to see them, to fight for them, to build something real in a world of facades. I've watched you these past years with more pride than I've ever been able to properly express. I saw you leave Morrison and Fletcher, saw the family's disappointment and disgust, heard them call it a breakdown, a phase, a waste of your education and potential. But I saw something else. I saw someone finally brave enough to live according to their own values, even when it cost them everything the family held sacred. You remember those visits to the community center, don't you? When I'd show up unannounced and sit with your kids while they did homework, while they told me about their dreams of college and their fears about money. You probably thought I was just an old woman with time to spare, filling empty hours with something that resembled purpose. But I was learning, Natalie. I was learning what you'd been trying to show me all along, that wealth means nothing if it doesn't serve something larger than itself. I had to stop reading again. Tears were blurring the words, and I didn't trust myself to continue without completely falling apart. Mr. Sullivan noticed, withdrew a handkerchief from his pocket and set it on the table within my reach, then returned to his position by the windows. The gesture was so kind, so understated, that it somehow made the emotion worse. I wiped my eyes, steadied myself, and kept reading. The key you received today is real. It opens something significant. But before I tell you what, I need you to understand why. The will reading that just concluded was legally binding. Victoria, Dennis and Ryan now own Brooks Development Corporation exactly as outlined. They have controlling interest in a company that bears our family name, that represents decades of work and hundreds of millions in assets. They received exactly what they expected, what they believed they deserved, what they've spent years positioning themselves to inherit. But here's what they don't know. What only you and Patrick Sullivan understand. Brooks Development Corporation is essentially hollow. Over the past 5 years, while you were building something meaningful in Pilsen, I was systematically dismantling everything I'd spent a lifetime creating. Not destroying it, mind you. Transforming it. Every luxury high-rise, every premium property, every asset the family believed would secure their wealth for generations, I've been quietly converting. My heart started pounding. I read the paragraph again, making sure I understood what she was saying. I liquidated the profitable properties, Natalie. Sold them to carefully selected buyers, structures the deals through entities that couldn't be traced back to me, and reinvested every dollar into something the family would never have approved. Affordable housing. Rent-controlled apartments. Community centers and youth facilities. Buildings that won't generate the profit margins Brooks Development is known for, but will house families who need them, will provide spaces for kids like the ones you work with every day. The company Victoria and Dennis and Ryan just inherited is drowning in debt. Strategic debt, carefully structured to look like normal business leverage until someone examines it closely. Which they will, probably within the next few weeks as they begin asserting control. They'll discover that the Brooks empire they believed they were inheriting is actually a shell, propped up by loans against assets that no longer exist in the form they remember. I couldn't breathe properly. The implications were staggering, cascading through my mind like dominoes falling in elaborate patterns. My grandmother had spent 5 years secretly dismantling her own empire, converting wealth into purpose, and she'd done it so carefully that no one had noticed until it was too late to stop her. The letter continued. The key you hold opens my private office. Not the one at Brooks Manor that the family knows about, the one where I entertained business associates and signed documents for company functions. This is different. It's in the Gold Coast penthouse, the property I purchased 40 years ago, and kept separate from all family dealings. The address is 1450 North Lake Shore Drive, penthouse level. Security knows you're coming. They have instructions to provide access whenever you arrive. Inside that office you'll find documentation for everything. Every property I converted, every investment I restructured, every transaction I completed over the past 5 years. You'll also find something else, a portfolio of assets that were never part of Brooks Development Corporation, that I acquired and managed separately throughout my entire career. Properties the family never knew existed because they were never meant to be part of the Brooks empire. They were meant to be insurance, owner Sullivan Associates for. A foundation for something different. Those properties, Natalie, are yours. Not the company, not the Brooks name, not the debt-laden structure I just gave to a family that measured my worth in quarterly earnings and market share. You inherit the actual value, the real estate that matters, the buildings that will continue serving communities long after Brooks Development Corporation collapses under the weight of its own carefully constructed obligations. I turned to the next page with trembling hands. The magnitude of what my grandmother had done was almost impossible to process. She hadn't just left me something. She'd orchestrated an entire secret redistribution of wealth, spent years moving pieces into place for a revelation that would reshape everything the family believed about their own legacy. The portfolio includes 63 properties across Chicago, apartment buildings, community centers, mixed-use developments, all carefully selected and quietly acquired. They're currently structured as rent-controlled housing, serving families who would otherwise be priced out of their own neighborhoods. The annual income is modest by Brooks Development standards, but it's stable, sustainable, and growing. More importantly, it's meaningful. These buildings house teachers and nurses and social workers and artists and families just trying to build something decent in a city that increasingly tells them they don't belong. You'll also find documentation showing that I've been your anonymous donor these past 5 years.
Every check I pressed into your hand at the community center, every contribution I made to Pilsen Community Services, it was never just charity, Natalie. It was investment. I was watching you build exactly the kind of organization that could eventually manage and expand this portfolio, that could turn individual properties into a network of genuine community support. The total value of what I'm giving you exceeds $60 million. But I need you to understand something crucial. This isn't wealth for wealth's sake. This is responsibility. These properties, these communities, they're trusting you now. The tenants who've lived in these buildings, some for decades, they're counting on continued stability, on leadership that sees them as people rather than revenue streams. I'm trusting you because you've already proven you understand that distinction. $60 million. The number seemed abstract. Impossible. I'd been living on a social worker's salary, shopping at thrift stores, taking the bus because parking downtown cost more than I wanted to spend. And now my grandmother was telling me I'd inherited assets worth more than everything my family had just divided among themselves. But the letter wasn't finished. The family will discover the truth about Brooks' development within weeks. Their attorneys will start asking questions, auditors will examine the books, and the carefully constructed facade will crumble. They'll realize that the company they inherited is worthless, or worse than worthless given the debt obligations. They'll look for someone to blame, and they'll remember that I changed in my final years, that I
started visiting community centers and asking questions about affordable housing and expressing interest in philanthropy that didn't come with galas and donor recognition. They may even suspect you somehow influenced me, manipulated an old woman into betraying her own family. Let them think what they want. You and I know the truth. You didn't change me, Natalie. You reminded me who I was before I became so focused on building an empire that I forgot to ask whether that empire served any purpose beyond its own expansion. When they come to you, and they will, you'll have a choice. You can tell them everything, show them this letter, explain exactly what I did and why. Or you can let them wonder. Let them struggle with their failing company while you quietly continue the work I started. Either way, you'll have the resources to build something lasting, something that matters. That's all I ever really wanted for you. Not comfort, not status, not the Brooks name, but the means to live according to your own values without having to sacrifice everything else. The final paragraph was shorter, more personal. I love you, Natalie. I'm proud of you, and I'm sorry I couldn't say these things more clearly while I was alive, that I let family politics and my own cowardice keep me from supporting you the way you deserved. This is my way of making that right, of ensuring that your courage isn't punished, that your choice to live with integrity doesn't mean you have to struggle forever. Build something beautiful, help people who need it, and remember that legacy isn't what we accumulate. It's what we choose to see in each other, and what we do with that vision. The letter was signed simply, with love, Helen. I sat there for a long time, the pages resting on the table in front of me, my grandmother's words rearranging everything I thought I understood about my life, my family, my own worth. Sullivan eventually returned to the table, taking the seat beside me rather than maintaining the formal distance of attorney and client. She made me promise not to interfere, he said quietly, not to explain or soften any of it. She wanted you to experience the will reading exactly as it happened, to feel what it was like to be dismissed by them one final time. She said you needed that clarity, that contrast, so you'd never doubt what you were choosing between. She destroyed the family business, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Spent 5 years systematically dismantling everything she built. She transformed it, he corrected gently. The properties still exist, the value is still there. It's just serving a different purpose now, helping different people, and the debt she structured for Brooks' development isn't insurmountable. If Victoria and Dennis and Ryan are willing to fundamentally change how they operate, to shift from luxury development to affordable housing, to actually serve communities rather than just profit from them, they could potentially recover. but that would require them to become people they've never been. I looked at him, this man who'd kept my grandmother's secret for years, who'd watched her execute this elaborate plan while maintaining the facade of dutiful family attorney. Did you try to talk her out of it? He smiled slightly. Every week for the first 6 months. I explained the legal complications, the family fallout, the potential for litigation. She listened patiently to every argument, then asked me a single question. Patrick, in all your years managing family wealth, have you ever seen money make someone genuinely better? I couldn't answer that. Still can't. The key was still in my other hand, warming against my palm. I looked at it now with complete understanding. It wasn't a joke or an insult. It was an invitation, a beginning, the literal means of accessing a truth that would change everything. What happens now? I asked. Mr. Sullivan stood, gathering the letter, and carefully placing it back in its envelope. Now you go to 1450 North Lake Shore Drive, you open that office. You review the documentation, and then you decide what kind of legacy you want to build with what Helen has given you. He paused at the door, looking back. She believed in you completely, Natalie. She wanted me to tell you that, in case the letter didn't make it clear enough. In 50 years of knowing her, I never saw her more certain about anything. Then he was gone, and I was alone in that glass conference room with a key, a letter, and the weight of $60 million and responsibility pressing down on my shoulders like an inheritance I'd never asked for, but somehow always been preparing to receive. I stood slowly, my legs unsteady, and walked to the windows. Chicago spread out below me, that sprawling city of neighborhoods and communities, of people fighting to afford their own lives while towers of luxury rose around them like monuments to someone else's wealth. Somewhere out there were 63 buildings my grandmother had acquired in secret, properties serving families who needed them, communities that were counting on stability in an increasingly unstable world, and now they were mine. Not to own in the way my family understood ownership, not to extract value, or maximize profit or leverage for personal gain. Mine to protect, to nurture, to use as foundation for something larger. The responsibility was terrifying, but standing there, holding that key, reading my grandmother's words over and over in my mind, I realized something else. I wasn't afraid of failing, I was afraid of not being brave enough to try. I pulled out my phone and took a picture of the key resting in my palm, the afternoon light catching its brass surface. Then I sent a text to Emma. Leaving now, long story, I'll call you later. I didn't know what I'd tell her, how much I'd share, whether the truth was mine to reveal, or mine to keep, while the family's carefully ordered world slowly crumbled around them. What I did know was that I needed to see that office, needed to understand the full scope of what my grandmother had built in secret, while pretending to maintain the empire her family expected. I needed to walk through those spaces, read those documents, stand in the physical evidence of faith that someone had seen me completely, and decided I was worth betting everything on. The elevator ride down felt longer than the ride up had been. I emerged into the parking garage where my old sedan sat between vehicles worth 10 times its value, and I had to suppress a slightly hysterical laugh. In a few hours, I'd probably own buildings worth more than every car in this garage combined. But I'd still be driving this beat-up Honda, still be living in my apartment in Logan Square, still be the same person who'd chosen purpose over profit 5 years ago. Except I wouldn't be struggling anymore. Wouldn't be choosing between paying rent and buying supplies for the community center. Wouldn't be deciding which bill to pay late so I could afford groceries. My grandmother had given me something I'd never expected, not wealth for its own sake, but the freedom to live according to my values, without having to sacrifice everything else. I drove toward the Gold Coast, toward the address my grandmother had written in her letter, toward an office that contained the documentation of a secret 5-year project to redistribute wealth in a way that actually served people who needed it. The traffic was typical for a Tuesday afternoon, cars moving in frustrated spurts, everyone trying to get somewhere they probably didn't want to be. I sat in it patiently, the key resting on the passenger seat, my grandmother's words cycling through my thoughts. What we choose to see becomes who we are. She'd written something similar in the letter, that legacy isn't what we build, but what we see in each other, and she'd seen me, really seen me, in a way my family never had. Not as a dropout or a disappointment or a waste of potential, but as someone brave enough to live with integrity even when it cost everything. The Gold Coast rose around me, that neighborhood of historic mansions and expensive high-rises, of old money and new wealth competing for space along Lake Michigan's shoreline. 1450 North Lake Shore Drive was exactly what I expected, a pre-war building that had probably been luxury apartments when my grandmother bought her penthouse 40 years ago. The doorman recognized me somehow, maybe from a photo Mr. Sullivan had provided, because he simply nodded and directed me to a private elevator in the back of the lobby. The elevator required the key to operate. I slid it into the brass plate, turned it, and felt the mechanism engage with a solid click. Then the elevator rose smoothly, numbers climbing past residential floors to the penthouse level, where the doors opened directly into a private foyer. The space took my breath away, not because of luxury, though it was certainly elegant, but because of what covered the walls. Photographs. My photographs, framed, carefully lit, arranged chronologically like a gallery exhibition of my entire career from art school to the present day. Every image I'd ever created, every piece I'd sold or given away or abandoned as not good enough, all of it was here, preserved and honored in a way I'd never imagined. I walked slowly through the foyer, into the main living space, and the collection continued. My early work from college, rough and unrefined, but showing hints of the vision I'd later develop. The street photography from my brief time in New York, trying to capture humanity in a city that moved too fast to notice individuals. The series I'd done on gentrification in Chicago, showing buildings being demolished, families being displaced, communities being erased in the name of development. And there, in a place of honor above the fireplace, was a photograph I didn't remember taking. It showed a woman's hands, weathered and strong, holding a key. Just a simple brass key on a plain metal ring. But the way the light caught it, the way those hands cradled it like something precious, transformed it into something profound. I stepped closer, and saw the small placard beneath the frame. What opens? No other explanation, no date, no context, just those two words. I turned away from the photographs, and saw the office door. It was closed, made of dark wood that matched the building's historic character, with a brass nameplate that simply read H. Brooks, Private. I approached it slowly, the key already in my hand, knowing that everything beyond that door would change my life irrevocably. The lock turned smoothly, and the door swung open to reveal a space that was part library, part war room, part sanctuary. One wall was floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, filled not with decorative volumes, but with working files, each labeled with an address, a date, a project name. Another wall held maps of Chicago, marked with pins and notes, showing patterns of investment and development that had clearly been tracked over years. But it was the desk that drew my attention. Large, solid, positioned to face windows that looked out over Lake Michigan, the same view I imagined my grandmother had gazed at while planning her secret transformation of family wealth into community service. On the desk's surface, arranged with careful precision, were 3 items. A leather portfolio, thick with documents, a vintage photograph in a silver frame, and a smaller envelope with my name written in that familiar script. I picked up the photograph first. It showed a young woman, maybe 25, standing in front of a construction site. She wore work clothes and a determined expression, her hands on her hips, her eyes challenging the camera to doubt her. It took me a moment to recognize my grandmother, Helen Brooks, before she became the matriarch of a real estate empire, before luxury developments and society galas, when she was just someone with vision and courage, trying to build something meaningful. The smaller envelope contained a note, handwritten on her personal stationery. Natalie, by the time you read this, you'll have read my longer letter, you'll understand what I've done and why. But I wanted to leave one more thing here, in this space where I did my real work, the work that mattered. This photograph was taken the day I broke ground on my first affordable housing project. I was your age, fighting banks that wouldn't lend to a woman, fighting a family that thought I should focus on more profitable ventures, fighting my own doubts about whether I could actually pull it off. I built that project. It still stands, still houses families, still serves a purpose beyond profit. But then I got scared. I let the family convince me that we needed to focus on luxury, on returns, on building an empire that would last generations. I spent 40 years creating exactly that, and in the process, I forgot the woman in this photograph. You reminded me of her. Every time I saw you choose principle over profit, service over status, meaning over money, I saw that young woman I used to be. This portfolio contains everything you need. 63 properties, full documentation, financial projections, tenant information. It also contains my plans for expansion, buildings I identified but never acquired, communities I wanted to serve but ran out of time to reach. Those are yours now. Not obligations, but possibilities. Build what you want. Serve who you want. Just promise me you'll stay true to that vision, that you won't let fear or family or the weight of wealth turn you into someone you're not. I believe in you completely. Helen. I set the note down carefully and opened the leather portfolio. Inside were documents organized with meticulous precision, each property detailed with acquisition records, tenant histories, financial statements, and notes in my grandmother's handwriting about the community each building served. I paged through slowly, beginning to understand the scope of what she'd created. Buildings in Pilsen, where I worked, providing housing for the families of the kids I helped every day. Properties in Bronzeville, historically significant structures she'd acquired and preserved, rather than letting them be demolished for luxury condos. Apartment buildings scattered across neighborhoods that gentrification had targeted, where she'd bought properties specifically to keep them affordable, to maintain stability for communities that needed it. Each file contained not just legal documents but stories. Notes about tenants, about families who'd lived in these buildings for generations, about small businesses operating on ground floors, about community organizations using spaces she'd quietly provided. She'd been paying attention, really paying attention, to the human impact of every decision. And interspersed with the existing properties were her notes about future possibilities. Buildings for sale in neighborhoods that needed affordable housing, potential partnerships with community organizations that could help manage expanded portfolios. Ideas for converting commercial properties into mixed-use developments that would serve rather than displace existing communities. She'd created not just a static inheritance, but a roadmap for growth, a foundation for something that could expand and evolve, and serve more people over time. I found myself sitting in her chair, at her desk, looking out over the lake, the way she must have done countless times, while planning all of this. The late afternoon sun painted the water in shades of gold and amber, and somewhere out there was the community center in Pilsen, where I'd be working tomorrow, helping kids with homework, supporting families navigating systems designed to keep them struggling. Except now I had resources. Now I had the means to do more than help individuals. I could impact entire communities, could preserve spaces, and create opportunities, and build networks of genuine support. The weight of it was enormous. $60 million in property, thousands of tenants counting on stability, communities trusting that these buildings would continue serving them, rather than being converted to luxury units that would force them out. This wasn't wealth I could simply enjoy or invest for personal gain. This was responsibility, sacred trust, the accumulated faith of a grandmother who'd spent 5 years secretly preparing to hand me the means to live my values at scale. My phone buzzed. A text from Emma. "Are you okay? Everyone's freaking out. Ryan's been calling lawyers. Something about discrepancies in the estate valuation. It was starting already. The family was beginning to discover that the empire they'd inherited wasn't what they believed it to be. Soon there would be accusations, litigation, demands for explanations. They'd want to know what happened to the Brooks wealth they'd been counting on, why the company they inherited was drowning in debt, while the profitable assets seemed to have vanished, and eventually, they'd learn the truth.
that their grandmother had spent 5 years systematically redistributing that wealth, converting luxury into affordability, transforming profit into purpose. They'd discover that the real inheritance had gone to the family member they'd dismissed, the one they'd laughed at, the one who'd chosen to work with poor families instead of extracting wealth from them. I thought about my grandmother's question in the letter. When they came to me, would I tell them everything, or let them wonder? Would I show them her letter, explain her reasoning, help them understand? Or would I maintain the silence, let them struggle with their failing company, while I quietly continued her work? The answer surprised me with its clarity. I would tell them. Not to gloat, or to justify, or to prove anything, but because they deserved to understand what they'd missed, what they'd failed to see. My grandmother had chosen to reveal the truth to me in that conference room, making me sit through their laughter and contempt, so I could see them clearly. Maybe they needed the same gift. Maybe seeing exactly what they'd valued and what they'd dismissed, understanding the full scope of what their priorities had cost them, would teach them something worth learning. Or maybe it wouldn't. Maybe they'd never understand, never recognize, that my grandmother's final act wasn't cruelty, but clarity, offering them the chance to become people capable of building something meaningful, instead of just extracting value from others' lives. Either way, the truth would be there, undeniable and complete. I gathered the portfolio, secured it carefully, and took one last look around the office. This space had been my grandmother's secret heart, the place where her real values lived, while she maintained the facade of Brooks Development Corporation's ruthless matriarch. Now it was mine. Not just the physical space, but what it represented. Permission to be fully myself, to live according to my principles, to build something that mattered without having to sacrifice everything else. The drive back to Logan Square felt surreal. I carried $60 million in documentation in my passenger seat, held the key to a penthouse filled with my own artwork, possessed knowledge that would reshape my entire family's reality. But I was still just Natalie, still drove the same beat-up car, still lived in the same small apartment, still cared about the same things I'd cared about when I walked away from Morrison and Fletcher 5 years ago. Except now I had the means to care at scale. To take the work I'd been doing one family at a time, and expand it to entire neighborhoods. To convert my grandmother's secret portfolio into a network of genuine community support. To prove that wealth could serve purpose, that legacy could mean something beyond quarterly earnings and property values. My phone rang as I parked outside my building. Emma's number. I answered. Natalie, where are you? Ryan's having a complete meltdown. The company financials don't make sense. Assets are missing. There's debt everywhere. Mom's locked herself in her office with 3 different lawyers. Uncle Dennis is threatening to sue the estate. Everyone's saying Grandma must have been incompetent at the end, that someone took advantage of her. Please tell me you know something. Please tell me this is all some kind of mistake. I closed my eyes, gripping the steering wheel. The truth was about to detonate through my family like a bomb. But hiding it would only delay the inevitable, and my grandmother had been clear. She wanted them to understand what they'd chosen, what they'd valued, what they'd been willing to dismiss as worthless. Emma, I said quietly, I need you to gather everyone. Tonight if possible, tell them I have information about the estate that they need to hear. Tell them Grandma left me something besides that key, and it explains everything. There was a long pause. You know what's happening, you know where the money went. I know exactly where it went, and I know why. But they deserve to hear it from me, all of them together, so there's no confusion about what she did, or why she did it. Natalie, they're going to lose it. When they find out you knew, when they realize you have answers they've been searching for, they're going to come at you with everything. I thought about my grandmother's letter, about her faith in my courage, about the portfolio of properties sitting on my passenger seat. Let them come. I'm done being afraid of their judgment. I'm done feeling small, because they decided I didn't matter. Grandma saw something in me they never could, and she built her real legacy around that vision. If they can't handle that truth, that's their problem to solve. Emma's voice was soft when she spoke again. You've changed. You sound different. No, I said, looking up at my apartment building, at the windows of the home I'd built for myself, when family wealth became irrelevant to my survival. I'm exactly who I've always been, I just finally have the resources to be that person without apology. They gathered at Brooks Manor 2 nights later, assembling in the same oak-paneled library where family meetings had been held for 3 generations. The room carried weight, history pressed into every surface, leather-bound books that no one read anymore lined the walls. Persian rugs, that had cost more than most people's cars, covered floors that creaked in specific places, announcing arrivals and departures. A portrait of my great-grandfather, the man who'd started the family business with a single apartment building on the south side, hung above the fireplace, his stern expression watching over descendants who'd turned his modest success into an empire. Victoria arrived first, her composure visibly fraying at the edges. Her suit was still impeccable, her posture still perfect, but there was something brittle in the way she moved, like she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. Ryan followed close behind, his usual confidence replaced by agitation. He kept checking his phone, presumably communicating with the lawyers and accountants who'd been trying to make sense of Brooks Development Corporation's suddenly incomprehensible finances. Uncle Dennis came in looking older than I'd ever seen him, the weight of discovery aging him in ways that time alone hadn't managed. He'd built things his entire life, turned blueprints into buildings, concrete plans into concrete reality. The idea that the company he'd helped construct was somehow hollow must have felt like watching his own life's work dissolve. Emma was there too, positioned slightly apart from the others, her expression cautious. She'd texted me earlier asking if I was sure about this, if there wasn't some quieter way to handle the situation. But I'd been certain. My grandmother had orchestrated a public humiliation for me at the will reading because she wanted me to see the family clearly. Now they deserved the same clarity, the same undeniable truth, delivered without softening or intermediary explanation. I stood near the fireplace, not sitting, needing the physical grounding of standing on my own feet for what was coming. The leather portfolio rested on the side table beside me, my grandmother's letter tucked inside. I debated how much to share, whether to read her words aloud, or simply explain the facts. In the end, I decided the family deserved to hear her voice, to understand this wasn't some scheme I'd concocted, but her deliberate, carefully planned final act. Victoria spoke first, her tone attempting authority, but landing somewhere closer to desperation. Natalie, we appreciate you coming. The estate situation has become complex, and we're hoping you might have information that could help clarify certain discrepancies. Mr. Sullivan mentioned Helen left you additional materials. We need to understand what happened to company assets that appear to be missing. I met her gaze steadily. They're not missing. Grandma knew exactly where every asset went, she spent 5 years planning it. The room went very still. Ryan stopped checking his phone, Uncle Dennis's attention sharpened. Even Emma, who'd suspected something significant, looked startled by the certainty in my voice. 5 years. Ryan's voice carried an edge. Planning what exactly? I opened the portfolio and withdrew my grandmother's letter, the pages she'd written in her own hand, the words she'd chosen carefully to explain the unexplainable. Before I answer that, I need you to hear something. Grandma wrote this specifically for me, but the truth it contains belongs to all of you. You deserve to understand what she did and why. Victoria's expression hardened. Natalie, if this is some kind of game, if you're withholding information about family assets, I'm not withholding anything, I interrupted, my voice calm but firm. I'm about to tell you everything, but you need to listen. Really listen. Because what she did, what she spent 5 years accomplishing, it's going to challenge every assumption you have about her, about the family, about what actually matters. I began reading. My grandmother's words filled the library, her voice channeled through mine, explaining the theater of the will reading, the deliberate humiliation, the test designed to reveal character under pressure. I watched their faces as understanding began to dawn, as they realized the entire inheritance ceremony had been staged specifically to expose their cruelty, their dismissiveness, their fundamental inability to see value in anything that didn't generate profit. Victoria's face flushed when I read the part about her calculating percentages while maintaining composure. Ryan actually flinched at the description of his assumed entitlement. Uncle Dennis closed his eyes briefly, and I couldn't tell if it was shame or anger or simply exhaustion. But I kept reading. Through the explanation of my choice to leave corporate law, through Grandma's pride in that decision, through her visits to the community center and what they'd taught her, I read about her systematic dismantling of Brooks Development Corporation, the liquidation of profitable assets, the conversion to affordable housing that the family would never have approved. When I reached the part about the debt, about the carefully structured obligations that made the company they'd inherited essentially worthless, Ryan stood abruptly. That's not possible. The valuations, the market assessments, everything showed the company was worth hundreds of millions. It was, I said simply. 5 years ago. But Grandma sold the profitable properties to buyers who wouldn't be traced back to her, and she reinvested every dollar into something the family would have rejected. Affordable housing, rent-controlled apartments, community facilities, buildings that serve people instead of extracting maximum profit from them. Uncle Dennis found his voice, rough and strained. She destroyed everything. 40 years of work, of building something lasting, and she just
destroyed it. She transformed it, I corrected, echoing Mr. Sullivan's words. The properties still exist. The value is still there. It's just serving a different purpose, helping different people. She didn't destroy your legacy. She revealed what it actually was. Luxury developments that displaced communities, premium housing that made the city unaffordable for the people who actually built it, an empire constructed on the principle that wealth should flow upward while everyone else scrambles for whatever remains. Victoria's composure finally cracked. And you approved of this? You helped her do it? Is that what those visits were about? Poisoning her mind against her own family? The accusation hung in the air, and I recognized it for what it was. Desperation. The need to blame someone, to find a villain in a story where they were being forced to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. I didn't know, I said quietly. I had no idea what she was planning until Mr. Sullivan gave me her letter 2 days ago. Every check she pressed into my hand at the community center, I thought it was just an old woman supporting her granddaughter's work. I didn't know she was systematically redirecting the family fortune into the same communities I was serving. I didn't know she'd been watching me, learning from me, remembering who she used to be before empire building became more important than purpose. I continued reading the letter, through the revelation about the anonymous donations, through the explanation of the portfolio I'd inherited, through the final paragraphs where Grandma Helen expressed her love and her faith in my ability to carry forward the work she'd started. When I finished, silence settled over the library like dust, heavy and uncomfortable. Emma spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. 63 properties. She gave you 63 properties worth $60 million. Not gave, I said. Entrusted. There's a difference. This isn't wealth for me to enjoy or invest for personal gain. It's responsibility. Thousands of tenants counting on stability, communities trusting these buildings will continue serving them. Grandma spent 5 years converting family wealth into community support, and now that work is mine to continue. Ryan's laugh was bitter, almost painful to hear. So that's it. The family member who walked away from everything, who rejected the Brooks legacy, who spent 5 years pretending to be too noble for money, she inherits the actual fortune, and we get debt and a failing company, and the pleasure of explaining to investors why our grandmother systematically sabotaged her own business. She didn't sabotage it, I said, though I knew the distinction wouldn't matter to him. She redirected it, and she left you with a choice. You can let the company fail, let it collapse under the debt and walk away from the Brooks name entirely, or you can fundamentally change what the company does. Shift from luxury development to affordable housing, actually serve the communities you've spent decades displacing, become people who build something meaningful instead of just extracting value. The infrastructure is still there, the knowledge, the connections, the basic business framework. You just have to decide whether you're willing to become different people to use it. Victoria stood, gathering her purse with shaking hands. This is unconscionable. Helen's will can be contested. We can argue incompetence, undue influence, a dozen different grounds. No judge will allow this kind of asset manipulation to stand. I'd been expecting this. Mr. Sullivan had warned me that legal challenges were inevitable, that the family would fight rather than accept what my grandmother had done. But I'd also reviewed the documentation in that Gold Coast office, seen the meticulous care with which every transaction had been structured, every decision documented, every legal requirement satisfied. You can try, I said calmly. But Grandma worked with Mr. Sullivan for 5 years on this. Every property sale was legitimate, every transaction properly recorded, every legal standard met. She wasn't incompetent, she was deliberate. And the courts will see that when they review the documentation. You'll waste money on lawyers, generate publicity that reveals exactly what kind of people you are, and ultimately lose anyway. Or you can accept what she did, and figure out what kind of legacy you want to build from here. Uncle Dennis was staring at the portrait above the fireplace, at his own father's stern expression. She betrayed everything he built, everything we built together. She took 40 years of family legacy, and just gave it away to strangers. She gave it to communities, I corrected. To families who needed housing, to people the Brooks empire had spent decades ignoring or displacing. And she didn't do it randomly or carelessly. Every property was chosen specifically to serve a need, to stabilize a neighborhood, to provide homes for people who were being priced out of their own city. That's not betrayal. That's finally using wealth the way it was meant to be used. Emma moved closer, not quite standing beside me but creating visible distance between herself and the rest of the family. What are you going to do with it? With the properties? The portfolio, all of it. I looked at her, saw genuine curiosity rather than judgment, and felt something loosen in my chest. I'm going to continue what Grandma started. Maintain the affordable housing, expand where possible, work with community organizations to make sure these buildings serve people who need them most. I'm also going to use the resources to grow the work I've been doing. Pilsen Community Services can reach more families, support more kids, create more opportunities. The buildings Grandma acquired become foundation for something larger, a network of genuine community support, instead of isolated services struggling to help individuals. Ryan shook his head slowly, and I couldn't tell if it was disbelief or disgust, or simply the inability to process what he was hearing. You're actually going to do it. You're going to take $60 million and use it for charity work, while we're left trying to salvage a company that's drowning in debt. It's not charity, I said, though I knew he wouldn't understand the distinction. It's community investment. It's using resources to help people build stable lives, which benefits everyone. And yes, I'm going to do exactly that. Because unlike you, I never measured my worth by how much I could accumulate, or how high I could climb. I measured it by whether I could look at myself honestly, and feel good about the choices I was making. Victoria had been silent for several moments, her mind clearly working through scenarios, calculating options, searching for leverage she could still apply. When she spoke, her voice was cold. You realize this makes you complicit. Whatever legal challenges emerge, whatever investigations occur, you're part of it now. You accepted assets that were stripped from the family company. You benefited from Helen's mental decline, from her inability to make sound decisions in her final years. The accusation was predictable, a last attempt to create doubt, to taint the inheritance by suggesting it was built on something shameful or illegal. But I'd spent 2 days reviewing every document in that Gold Coast office, understanding exactly how carefully my grandmother had structured everything. Grandma's mental state was evaluated by 3 independent physicians in the past year, I said calmly. All found her completely competent. Mr. Sullivan has documentation of every meeting, every decision, Every instruction she gave, her choices weren't the result of decline. They were the product of clarity she'd been building toward for years. She finally understood what actually mattered, and she had the courage to act on that understanding even though she knew it would devastate you. The words landed hard. I could see them register, see the family confronting the truth that this wasn't some scheme or manipulation or sign of incompetence. This was intentional, deliberate. Their own grandmother, the woman they'd respected and honored and assumed agreed with their values, had looked at everything they represented and decided it needed to be dismantled. Uncle Dennis moved toward the door, his movements heavy with something that looked like grief. I need to leave. I can't be here right now. Victoria followed without another word, her carefully constructed composure finally giving way to something rarer, more honest. She didn't look at me as she passed, but I saw her blinking rapidly, fighting tears she wouldn't allow to fall in front of witnesses. Ryan lingered, staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. Anger, certainly. Bewilderment. But also something else, something that might have been the first stirring of actual self-examination. Did you enjoy it? He asked finally. Reading that letter, watching us realize what happened. Did it feel good, getting revenge for all those years of family disapproval? The question deserved an honest answer. I thought about it carefully before responding. No. It didn't feel good. It felt necessary. Grandma didn't do this to hurt you. She did it to show you something you needed to see. That the values you've spent your lives defending, the legacy you thought you were protecting, it was hollow. Built on displacement and extraction and the idea that some people matter more than others. She wanted you to understand what you'd become, what you'd been willing to dismiss as worthless. Whether you learn anything from that is up to you. He left without responding, and then it was just Emma and me in that library, surrounded by books and history, and the weight of family expectations that had just been fundamentally reordered. Emma sank into one of the leather chairs, her professional composure dissolving into genuine emotion. I don't know what to feel. Part of me is angry at Grandma for destroying the family business. Part of me is angry at myself for being angry about that. And part of me is just sad that it came to this, that she felt like she had to orchestrate this whole elaborate plan instead of just talking to us. I sat across from her, the portfolio still in my lap. She tried talking. Remember all those conversations at family dinners, about affordable housing, about community responsibility, about whether wealth should serve something beyond itself. Remember how everyone shut her down, changed the subject, made it clear that kind of thinking had no place at the Brooks table. Emma nodded slowly. I remember. I sat there silent every time, not wanting to cause problems, not wanting to choose sides. I told myself I was being diplomatic, but really I was just being a coward. You're here now, I said. That counts for something. She looked at me with an expression that mixed hope and uncertainty. What happens to the family? To us, I mean. Does this destroy everything? Or is there some way forward that doesn't require us to completely abandon each other? It was the question I'd been avoiding, the one I wasn't sure I could answer. The inheritance had created a divide that felt unbridgeable. On one side, the family members who'd received what they expected and discovered it was worthless. On the other, the relative they'd dismissed who'd inherited actual value. The resentment, the anger, the sense of betrayal they must be feeling. It wasn't something that would dissolve quickly or easily. I don't know, I admitted. I know I'm not interested in pretending everything's fine, in going to holiday dinners where we all perform family unity while pretending this never happened. But I'm also not interested in permanent estrangement, if there's genuine willingness to examine what went wrong, to understand what Grandma was trying to show us. Emma was quiet for a long moment, processing. Then she asked the question I'd been waiting for. Can I help? With the properties, the community work, whatever you're planning to build. I know I don't have your experience or your vision, but I want to be part of something meaningful. I'm tired of measuring my life by promotions and acquisitions, and whether I'm living up to family expectations that were never really mine to begin with. The offer surprised me, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Emma had always been different from Victoria and Ryan, more thoughtful, more conflicted about the family path she'd been following, and Grandma's letter had mentioned this possibility, the idea that some family members might find their way to genuine change if given the opportunity. Yes, I said simply. There's plenty of work, and I'll need people I can trust. People who understand what we're trying to build and why it matters. But it means fundamentally changing how you think about success, about worth, about what legacy actually means. It means choosing purpose over profit, even when it costs you everything the family has always valued. She smiled, and it was the first genuine expression of peace I'd seen on her face in years. I've watched you make that choice every day for 5 years. I think I'm finally ready to try it myself. We sat there in that library, for another hour, talking through possibilities and plans, imagining what the portfolio could become, with dedicated expansion, with genuine community partnership, with resources that prioritized people over profit margins. Emma asked questions about the properties, about the communities they served, about the work happening at Pilsen Community Services, and for the first time, I saw her as someone potentially capable of real contribution, of actual transformation. When we finally left Brooks Manor, the house felt different somehow. Lighter, maybe, or simply more honest. The pretense that had filled those rooms for generations had been stripped away, replaced by hard truth that demanded genuine reckoning. The family might never recover from what my grandmother had done. They might spend years in legal battles and bitter recrimination, might never speak to me again except through lawyers. But they'd also been given something valuable, even if they couldn't recognize it yet. The chance to examine their own values, to understand what they'd been willing to sacrifice in pursuit of wealth and status, to potentially become people capable of building something that actually mattered. Whether they took that chance was up to them. I drove home through Chicago streets that felt simultaneously familiar and transformed. The city looked the same, buildings rising against the night sky, lights marking where people lived their lives, largely unaware of the small earthquake that had just reshaped one family's legacy. But I knew something had fundamentally shifted. The portfolio resting on my passenger seat represented more than properties and assets. It represented faith that someone had seen me completely and decided I was worth betting everything on. My phone buzzed with a text from Mr. Sullivan. I assume the family meeting occurred. How did it go? I pulled over to respond properly. About as expected. Anger, denial, threats of legal action, but also the first hints of something else. Emma wants to help with the work. Victoria and Ryan and Dennis will probably fight. But the truth is out there now, undeniable. His response came quickly. Helen knew there would be backlash. She accepted it as necessary cost of doing something right. She also believed some of them might eventually understand. For what it's worth, I think she'd be proud of how you handled this. I sat in my car for several minutes, letting his words settle. My grandmother had orchestrated this entire elaborate plan, spent 5 years preparing, all to ensure I'd have the resources to live according to my values, without having to sacrifice everything else. She'd known it would hurt the family, would generate conflict and anger, and possible permanent rifts. But she'd done it anyway, because she believed some truths were more important than comfortable lies. The key to the Gold Coast penthouse was still in my bag, along with my grandmother's letters, and the documentation of 63 properties now waiting for my stewardship. Tomorrow I'd need to start the practical work of understanding the full scope of what I'd inherited, of building systems and partnerships, and plans for sustainable expansion. Tomorrow I'd need to figure out how to transform individual properties into a genuine network of community support. But tonight, I allowed myself to simply feel the weight of it, not the money, or the assets, or the responsibility,
but the deeper inheritance my grandmother had given me, permission to be fully myself, validation that choosing integrity over affluence wasn't foolish or wasteful, or a betrayal of family legacy, faith that one person's vision, consistently applied, could actually reshape how wealth moved through the world. I pulled back into traffic and headed toward Logan Square, toward my small apartment that suddenly felt less like evidence of failure and more like proof of principle. The families I'd been helping one at a time could now be served at scale. The kids struggling with homework in donated spaces could access better resources, more opportunities, stronger foundations for building their own futures. The communities being displaced by luxury development could find stability in properties specifically protected for their needs. This was what my grandmother had seen when she looked at me, not a dropout or a disappointment, but someone willing to choose differently, to value differently, to build differently. And she'd spent 5 years secretly constructing the infrastructure that would allow that different kind of building to happen at a scale that actually mattered. When I finally climbed the 3 flights of stairs to my apartment, I found a package waiting outside my door. No return address, just my name written in familiar script. Inside was a single photograph, the image I'd seen above the fireplace in the Gold Coast penthouse. A woman's weathered hands, holding a brass key, light transforming it into something precious. On the back, my grandmother had written a final message, probably composed the same day she'd written her letters, probably intended to arrive exactly when I'd need it most. Natalie, this photograph was your first sale. A stranger bought it from that basement show in art school, the one where you weren't sure anyone would come. I was that stranger. I've been collecting your work since the beginning, watching your vision develop, seeing how you capture humanity in ways others miss. Keep seeing that way. Keep showing others what you see, and remember that the key in this image opens more than doors. It opens possibilities. Use them well. With all my love, Helen. I set the photograph on my kitchen counter, leaning it against the wall where I'd see it every morning. Then I made tea, and sat by the window, looking out over the neighborhood I'd chosen when family wealth became irrelevant to my survival. The Thai restaurant below was closing, the owner pulling down the metal gate, ending another day of feeding people who appreciated good food more than fancy atmospheres. Tomorrow would bring challenges I couldn't fully predict, legal complications, family conflicts, the enormous practical work of managing a portfolio designed to serve rather than profit. But tonight, I sat with the knowledge that I'd been seen completely by someone who mattered, that my choice to live with integrity had been witnessed and honored, and ultimately rewarded in ways I'd never imagined possible. The key my family had laughed at now opened doors to 63 properties, and a future built on purpose, rather than profit. And my grandmother, in her quiet way, in her carefully orchestrated final act, had proven that legacy isn't what we accumulate. It's what we choose to see in each other, and what we do with that vision. I slept better that night than I had in years, not because my circumstances had changed, though they certainly had, but because I finally understood something my grandmother had been trying to show me all along. Being true to yourself isn't weakness or foolishness or a waste of potential. It's the hardest, bravest thing a person can do. And when someone sees that courage and decides to build their own final legacy around honoring it, that's not just inheritance. That's love made visible, faith made concrete, vision transformed into possibility. The $10 check my family had given me at the will reading was still in my bag, uncashed and probably destined to remain that way. But unlike before, it no longer stung. It had become something else entirely. Evidence of a moment when I'd been tested and passed, when the family's cruelty had revealed exactly what my grandmother needed me to understand before trusting me with the truth. They'd laughed at what they thought was an insult, never realizing it was the final piece of a test I'd been taking for 5 years without knowing it. And I'd passed not by accumulating wealth or status or family approval, but by choosing meaning over all of those things, by staying true when no one was watching, by building something real in a world of facades. That was what the key unlocked. Not just properties or assets or financial security, but the freedom to be completely myself while having the resources to turn that self into something that could serve others. My grandmother had seen that possibility when everyone else saw failure, had bet her entire fortune on my ability to use wealth the way it was meant to be used. And now the work began, not the work of managing properties, or expanding portfolios, or navigating family conflict, though all of that was coming. The deeper work of proving that her faith was well placed, that her vision was achievable, that one person choosing integrity could actually reshape how wealth moved through the world, who it served, whose lives it improved. I was ready, not because I had all the answers or complete confidence, but because I finally understood what my grandmother had been trying to teach me. Legacy isn't built in boardrooms or measured in quarterly earnings. It's constructed in quiet moments of choice, in decisions to see people others ignore, in courage to value purpose over profit, even when the cost is everything the world tells us matters. She'd lived that truth in secret for 5 years, dismantling her own empire to build something better. Now that work was mine to continue, mine to expand, mine to transform into something that would outlive both of us. Not because of the money, though that would certainly help, but because of the vision she'd recognized in me, the capacity to see what others missed and build something meaningful from that seeing. The key rested on my counter beside the photograph, brass catching the streetlight coming through my window. Tomorrow it would open doors I'd never imagined walking through. But tonight, it was simply a symbol of something I'd finally learned to believe, that staying true to yourself, even when it costs everything, isn't foolishness, it's the only thing that actually matters. And sometimes, if you're lucky, someone sees that courage and decides to build their final act around honoring it. My grandmother had given me more than wealth. She'd given me validation that the path I'd chosen was worth walking, that the values I'd defended were worth defending, that the vision I'd been following was worth following to its conclusion. And in doing so, she'd transformed what the family saw as my greatest failure into the foundation for something that could actually change lives. That was inheritance. That was legacy. That was love. The first board meeting happened 3 weeks after I'd revealed the truth to my family. Brooks Development Corporation's newly inherited leadership had called an emergency session, ostensibly to address the financial crisis now threatening the company's survival. But I knew the real purpose. They wanted answers from the one person who held them, wanted to understand how their grandmother had systematically dismantled an empire while they remained oblivious, wanted someone to blame for the catastrophe now consuming their professional lives. I arrived at the Brooks Development headquarters downtown, a glass tower the family had commissioned 15 years ago as monument to their success. The building occupied premium real estate in the financial district, its lobby decorated with architectural renderings of luxury developments bearing the Brooks name. Awards lined one wall, civic recognition for projects that had transformed neighborhoods, though the renderings never showed the families displaced, or the affordable housing demolished to make room for premium units. The conference room on the executive floor was designed for intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, the view itself a power statement. The table could seat 20, though only 6 people were present when I entered. Victoria, at the head, her position claiming authority she legally possessed. Ryan to her right, Uncle Dennis beside him. 2 board members I recognized from family events, loyal allies who'd supported Brooks Development for decades. And Emma, sitting slightly apart from the others, her presence suggesting she'd been required to attend rather than choosing to participate. Mr. Sullivan was there too, positioned neutrally at the table's center. His expression revealed nothing, but I knew he'd prepared for this meeting as carefully as my grandmother had prepared for the will reading. Every legal document had been reviewed, every potential challenge anticipated, every argument crafted to withstand scrutiny. Victoria didn't wait for pleasantries. Natalie, thank you for coming. I assume you understand why we've asked you here. I took the empty seat across from her, setting my bag down deliberately. You want to understand what Grandma did, how she did it, and whether there's any legal recourse that might reverse the situation. You're hoping I'll reveal some flaw in her planning, some mistake that would allow you to reclaim what you believe you're owed. Ryan leaned forward aggressively. We're hoping you'll acknowledge that what Helen did was essentially theft, stripping, unauthorized liquidation, systematic dismantling of a company she had fiduciary responsibility to protect. We've had 3 different law firms review the situation, and they all agree there are grounds for legal action. Mr. Sullivan cleared his throat gently. Actually, Mr. Brooks, if you'll allow me to clarify, the firms you consulted identified potential arguments, but they also noted significant obstacles to successful litigation. Mrs. Brooks's actions, while unexpected, were entirely within her legal rights as majority shareholder. Every transaction was properly documented, every sale conducted at fair market value, every legal requirement satisfied. Gerald Hutchins, a man who'd served Brooks Development since my grandfather's time, spoke with barely contained frustration. Legal or not, it was a betrayal. Helen spent 40 years building this company, and then she destroyed it. She deliberately created debt obligations, sold profitable assets, and left us with a shell of what the company should have been. That's not stewardship, that's sabotage. I'd been expecting this narrative, the framing of my grandmother's actions as destruction rather than transformation. It was easier for them to see her choices as betrayal than to examine what those choices revealed about their own values. She didn't destroy anything, I said evenly. Every property she sold still exists, still houses people, still serves a function. She just changed who those properties serve, and who profits from them. Instead of luxury developments generating maximum returns for Brooks shareholders, those buildings now
Provide affordable housing for families who need it. The value didn't vanish, it was redirected toward purpose instead of profit. Victoria's composure cracked slightly. Purpose? We had purpose. We built quality housing, created jobs, contributed to the city's development. Just because we charged market rates doesn't mean we weren't serving a legitimate need. You served the needs of people who could afford premium prices, I countered, the same people who could afford housing anywhere. Meanwhile, teachers and nurses and social workers, people essential to the city's functioning, they couldn't afford to live in neighborhoods your developments occupied. Grandma recognized that pattern, understood what it was doing to communities, and decided her wealth could serve something more important than shareholder value. Uncle Dennis had been silent, but he finally spoke, his voice heavy. You talk about this like it was noble, like Helen was some kind of hero for tearing down what we built together, but you know what I see? I see my life's work turned into a joke. 40 years of construction, of turning vision into reality, of building things that lasted, and it all meant nothing. She made it all meaningless. The pain in his voice was genuine, and I felt an unexpected surge of empathy. He'd devoted his career to Brooks Development, had measured his worth by the buildings he'd helped create, and now he was being told that legacy was built on the wrong foundation. It's not meaningless, I said more gently. The skills you developed, the knowledge you gained, the actual construction expertise, that's real and valuable. What changed wasn't your ability or your contribution. What changed was understanding of who that ability should serve. Grandma didn't erase your work. She challenged you to use it differently, to build for communities that need quality housing, instead of just for people who can pay premium prices. Ryan's laugh was harsh. That's a beautiful sentiment, Natalie. Very inspiring. But it doesn't pay the bills. It doesn't satisfy the debt obligations Helen created. It doesn't solve the very real problem that we've inherited a failing company, with minimal assets and massive liabilities. Your grandmother's noble vision is going to bankrupt us. Mr. Sullivan intervened again. His voice measured, the company faces challenges, certainly, but bankruptcy isn't inevitable. The debt is substantial, but manageable if the new leadership is willing to fundamentally restructure the business model. Mrs. Brooks actually left a roadmap for that transition, documents outlining how Brooks Development could shift focus from luxury construction to affordable housing development, partnering with city programs and nonprofit organizations to create sustainable community-focused projects. Victoria stared at the attorney. "You're saying Helen expected us to become a nonprofit, to abandon everything the company represents and start building low-income housing?" "Not nonprofit," Mr. Sullivan clarified, "but reduced profit, mission-driven development. There are successful models for this approach. Companies that generate reasonable returns while prioritizing community benefit." Mrs. Brooks researched extensively before making her decisions. She believed Brooks Development had the expertise and connections to transition successfully if the leadership was willing. The board member who hadn't yet spoken, Caroline Morrison, shook her head slowly. "Even if we wanted to pursue that direction, which frankly seems like professional suicide, we don't have the capital. The profitable assets are gone. The company's reputation is about to be destroyed when word gets out about our financial situation. No investor will touch us. No bank will extend credit. Helen's roadmap might exist, but it's completely impractical, given the reality she created." This was the moment I'd been anticipating, the point where the meeting would shift from recrimination to actual decision-making. I reached into my bag and withdrew a folder I'd prepared, documents outlining a possibility I'd spent the past 3 weeks developing with advice from Mr. Sullivan and consultation with community development experts. "There might be another option," I said, sliding the folder across the table toward Victoria. "A way to stabilize Brooks Development while actually pursuing the mission-driven approach Grandma envisioned." Victoria opened the folder cautiously, scanning the first page. Her expression shifted from suspicion to confusion. "This is a proposal for a partnership between Brooks Development and a new entity called Lambert Community Holdings." Lambert was Grandma's middle name, I explained. "I've been working with advisors to structure the portfolio. She left me into a formal community development organization. Lambert Community Holdings will own and manage the 63 properties I inherited, but it will also partner with Brooks Development on new projects. We provide capital and community connections. You provide construction expertise and development experience. Joint ventures focused on affordable housing, mixed income developments, community facilities." Ryan was reading over his mother's shoulder, his expression skeptical. "You're offering to bail us out? After everything that's happened, after Grandma deliberately destroyed our company to benefit you, you're going to rescue us with the money she gave you?" I met his gaze steadily. "I'm offering a partnership that would allow both organizations to accomplish more than either could alone. Lambert Holdings has capital and community trust, but limited development experience. Brooks Development has expertise and infrastructure, but needs mission realignment and financial stability. Together, we could actually build what Grandma envisioned, housing that serves communities while generating enough return to sustain operations." Uncle Dennis studied the proposal, his construction background making him focus on the practical details. "This would require complete restructuring of how we operate. Different profit margins, different client base, different success metrics. We'd essentially be becoming a different company." "Yes," I acknowledged, "that's exactly what it would require. You'd have to decide whether you're willing to measure success by families housed rather than maximum returns generated, by community stability rather than investor profits. It means becoming people who build for purpose, instead of just building for wealth." Victoria closed the folder carefully, her expression unreadable. "And if we refuse, if we reject this partnership and pursue our own path," Mr. Sullivan answered before I could, "then Brooks Development faces its current reality without assistance. The debt obligations remain, the asset base is insufficient, and the company likely fails within 18 months. You'd be legally protected from personal liability, but the Brooks name, the family legacy and development, it would effectively end." The silence that followed was profound. I watched the family members process their options, watched them confront the choice my grandmother had deliberately created. They could cling to their old values, their old ways of measuring worth, and watch everything collapse. Or they could transform, could become people capable of building something that actually served communities, and in doing so, preserve at least a version of the family legacy. Emma spoke for the first time, her voice quiet but clear. I think we should accept, not because we don't have other options, but because it's the right thing to do. Grandma saw something we missed, understood something we refused to acknowledge. Maybe instead of fighting her vision, we should actually try to understand it. Victoria turned to her daughter with an expression mixing surprise and something that might have been disappointment. You're taking her side? After everything, I'm taking the side of actually building something meaningful, Emma replied, her voice strengthening. I've spent 3 weeks watching this company implode, watching everyone scramble to blame someone else, and I'm tired of it. Tired of measuring my worth by profit margins, tired of pretending that displacement is just market forces, tired of being part of something that treats people as obstacles to maximum return. If Natalie's offering a way forward that doesn't require us to keep being those people, I want to take it. Ryan looked at his sister like he'd never seen her before. You've changed. Since when do you care about community service and affordable housing? Since I finally admitted I never actually wanted to be part of what this company represented, Emma said. I just didn't have the courage to walk away like Natalie did. But maybe I don't have to walk away. Maybe there's a path that lets me use what I know for something that matters. Gerald Hutchins cleared his throat. I need to be direct. If Brooks Development pursues this partnership, I'll be resigning from the board. I've spent 40 years in luxury development, and I don't believe in this mission-driven approach. I think it's financially unsustainable and professionally unwise. But I also recognize the company's current position, and I won't stand in the way of a decision the family makes. Caroline Morrison nodded slowly. I feel similarly. This isn't the company I joined, isn't the vision I supported. But I also understand the practical reality. Without significant capital infusion, Brooks Development has no future. If the family chooses this partnership, I'll respect that decision, but I won't be part of its execution. Victoria absorbed these statements, understanding that the board she'd relied on was fracturing, that the allies who'd supported traditional Brooks Development were stepping away. She looked at Uncle Dennis, silently asking for his position. He was staring at the proposal, his rough hands resting on the table, and when he spoke, his voice carried decades of experience with hard choices. I've built things my whole life. Started as a laborer, worked my way up, learned every aspect of construction from foundation to finishing, and I've been proud of what I built, proud of the Brooks buildings rising across the city. But I've also driven past those buildings and wondered who actually lives in them, who they serve, whether they make the city better or just more expensive. He paused, seeming to struggle with words that didn't come naturally. Helen was right about some things, not the way she did it, maybe, not the deception or the secrecy, but about what we'd become, about how we measured success. If there's a way to keep building, to use what I know for something that actually helps people who need it, I'm willing to try, even if it means admitting we were wrong about what mattered. The admission hung in the air, transforming the dynamic in ways I hadn't anticipated. Uncle Dennis, the family member most committed to traditional Brooks values, was acknowledging the need for fundamental change. If he could consider that possibility, maybe others could too. Victoria was silent for a long moment, and I could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. Pride versus pragmatism, legacy versus survival, old values versus new possibilities. Finally she spoke, her voice carefully controlled. I need time. This isn't a decision to make in a single meeting. I need to review the partnership terms thoroughly, consult with advisors, understand exactly what we'd be committing to, but I'm willing to consider it, which is more than I would have said an hour ago. It was a small opening, But it was something. I nodded. That's fair, Mr. Sullivan can provide additional documentation, financial projections, case studies of similar partnerships that have worked. Take whatever time you need, but understand that Lambert Community Holdings is moving forward regardless. We're already negotiating for 3 new properties, already developing relationships with community organizations, already building the infrastructure Grandma envisioned. This partnership would strengthen both organizations, but it's not a necessity for Lambert, it's an opportunity for Brooks. Ryan bristled at the implication. You're saying you don't actually need us. This generous offer is just charity, letting us tag along on your mission-driven projects. I'm saying we'd be stronger together, I corrected. Lambert has resources and community trust, but we lack your development expertise. Brooks has knowledge and infrastructure, but you need capital and mission realignment. Neither organization is doing the other a favor. This would be genuine partnership, both sides contributing what the other needs, both sides benefiting from the collaboration. Emma reached across the table and picked up the proposal. I'd like to work on this, reviewing the terms, developing the operational framework, building the partnership structure, if that's acceptable to everyone. Victoria looked at her daughter with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between concern and cautious respect. You're serious about this? About fundamentally changing your career direction? About pursuing this community development path? I'm serious about finally doing something I actually believe in, Emma said simply. I've spent 5 years watching Natalie choose principle over profit, watching her build something meaningful while we built bigger profit margins. I want to know what that feels like, to measure my work by whether it helps people instead of whether it maximizes return. The meeting concluded without final decisions, but with something more important: the possibility of transformation, the acknowledgement that change might be necessary, the first tentative steps toward becoming people capable of building something that actually mattered. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was movement, which was more than I'd expected. As people gathered their materials and prepared to leave, Uncle Dennis approached me quietly. That thing you said about my skills being valuable, but needing to serve different communities, did you mean that, or were you just being diplomatic? I met his eyes directly. I meant it. You know how to build quality housing that lasts, how to manage construction projects, how to solve problems that come up in development. That knowledge doesn't become worthless, because we're building for different people. If anything, it becomes more important. Communities that have been underserved deserve the same quality you've always delivered, the same attention to detail, the same commitment to building things that endure. He nodded slowly, processing. Helen used to say something similar. Years ago when we were just starting, she'd say the real test of a builder wasn't creating luxury for people who could afford anything, but creating quality for people who couldn't afford to settle for less. I'd forgotten that. We both had. It's not too late to remember, I said quietly. He left without responding, but something in his posture suggested the conversation had landed, that maybe transformation wasn't entirely impossible even for family members most resistant to change. Mr. Sullivan walked out with me, maintaining professional distance until we reached the elevator. Then he allowed a small smile. That went better than I anticipated. I expected more hostility, more absolute refusal to consider partnership. The crisis helped, I said. It's easier to consider change when the alternative is complete failure. If Brooks' development was still profitable, still successful in traditional terms, they'd never have listened to any of this. Helen understood that, he noted. She structured the debt carefully to create urgency without making recovery impossible. She wanted them uncomfortable enough to reconsider their values, but not so destroyed they'd have no opportunity to rebuild differently. We rode down in silence, and when the elevator doors opened to the lobby, I paused. Do you think they'll actually do it, accept the partnership, transform the company, become people who build for communities instead of profit? Mr. Sullivan considered the question carefully. Some of them will. Emma clearly.
Dennis maybe, if he can overcome his pride. Victoria and Ryan are harder to predict, but here's what I know for certain. Helen gave them the opportunity. She didn't just criticize their values or condemn their choices. She created a practical path towards something better, made it possible for them to transform without losing everything. Whether they take that path is up to them. I left the Brooks Development Building and walked toward where I'd parked, needing the movement to process what had just happened. The meeting hadn't resolved anything definitively, but it had opened possibilities I hadn't been sure existed. The family might actually partner with Lambert Holdings, might actually redirect their expertise toward community service, might actually become people capable of building Grandma's vision alongside me. My phone rang as I reached my car, Emma's name on the screen. I answered. I meant what I said in there. She began without preamble. About wanting to work on the partnership, about changing direction, but I need you to know something. I'm not doing this to get back in your good graces, or to prove I'm different from the rest of the family. I'm doing it because I finally understand what Grandma was trying to show us, what you've been living all along, that measuring your life by wealth and status leaves you empty, even when you're successful, especially when you're successful. I leaned against my car, processing her words. What changed? 3 weeks ago you were sitting in that conference room during the will reading, part of the family consensus that I'd wasted my potential. I was, she admitted, but then I saw what Grandma actually did, understood the choice she made, realized she'd been watching us for years, and decided we weren't worth her real legacy. That stung more than the financial loss. She looked at her own family, and concluded we weren't capable of handling anything that mattered. And the worst part was, she was right. We'd become exactly the kind of people who treat wealth as the only measure of worth. And now, I asked. Now I want to prove her wrong, or maybe prove her right about me specifically, that I'm capable of being different even if the rest of the family isn't. I want to work on projects that actually help people, use what I know for something beyond maximizing return. And I want to learn from you, understand how you've measured success all these years, what it feels like to work towards something meaningful. It was the most honest Emma had been with me in years, maybe ever. The carefully maintained family loyalty had cracked, revealing someone genuinely struggling to become better than she'd been raised to be. Okay, I said. Then let's start. Come to Pilsen tomorrow. See the community center, meet the families we work with, understand what affordable housing actually means in practice. Not the abstract concept, but the real impact on real people. If you're serious about this, you need to understand what we're building toward. I'll be there, she promised. And Natalie, thank you for offering the partnership, for giving us an option that doesn't require complete destruction. Grandma set this up to teach us something, and I'm finally ready to learn. The call ended, and I sat in my car for several minutes, watching people move through the financial district, everyone rushing toward obligations and aspirations. I drove toward Pilsen, toward the community center, where I'd been working for 5 years, where Grandma had visited and sat with kids doing homework, and quietly understood what I'd been trying to show her. Maria Gonzalez was at the center when I arrived, reviewing applications for the after-school program. She looked up when I entered, her expression brightening. Natalie, I was hoping you'd come by. We got notice that our lease is being renewed for 5 years, and the rent is actually decreasing. The landlord's letter said something about new ownership and new priorities. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? I smiled, setting my bag down. The building is now owned by Lambert Community Holdings. We're committed to maintaining affordable rent for organizations serving this community. Consider it a long-term investment in what you're building here. Her eyes widened. You bought the building. How did you? I mean, when did this happen? It's complicated, I said, which was the understatement of the century. But the short version is that I inherited resources, specifically intended for community investment, and this center, this work, it's exactly what those resources were meant to support. Maria crossed herself, blinking back tears. Do you know what this means? We've been operating year to year, never sure if we'd be priced out, if we'd have to move, if we'd lose the relationships we've built in this neighborhood. 5 years of stability. That's everything. I watched her process the news, saw the weight of uncertainty lifting from her shoulders, and understood something my grandmother must have known from the beginning. Money's real power wasn't in what it could buy for yourself, it was in what it could secure for others, the stability it could create, the possibilities it could protect. There's more, I said. I'm building a partnership with other community organizations, creating a network of support across multiple neighborhoods, affordable housing, youth programs, job training, health services. We want to work with established organizations like yours, provide resources and coordination while respecting the expertise you've already developed. Maria sat down slowly, overwhelmed. Why? Why are you doing this? It was the same question Ryan had asked in the board meeting, but Maria's question came from different place, from years of watching resources flow away from communities like hers, from experience with promises that never materialized. Because someone believed in me when I chose this work over wealth, I said simply. Someone saw me serve this community and decided that vision was worth supporting, even if it meant dismantling her own empire to do it. Now I have the chance to expand that vision, to build what she started, to prove that wealth can actually serve something beyond itself. We talked for another hour, planning how Lambert Holdings could support the center's expansion, discussing other organizations in Pilsen that might benefit from partnership, imagining what the neighborhood could become if resources were directed toward community strength rather than displacement. The sun was setting when I finally left the center, painting the neighborhood in amber light. I thought about the family meeting, about Victoria's cautious willingness to consider partnership, about Emma's genuine desire for transformation, about Uncle Dennis's admission that they'd lost sight of what mattered. I drove home through streets my grandmother had helped shape, past buildings bearing the Brooks name. Now the Brooks legacy was being rewritten. Not erased, but redirected. My apartment felt different when I climbed those 3 flights of stairs. Not physically changed, but my relationship to it had shifted. This wasn't evidence of failure anymore. It was simply home, a space I'd chosen because it fit my needs. My phone buzzed with an email from Mr. Sullivan. The subject line read "Family Decision." The message was brief. Mrs. Ashworth has formally accepted the partnership proposal. Brooks Development will restructure as mission-driven affordable housing developer, partnering with Lambert Community Holdings on joint ventures. Board composition will change significantly, with Gerald Hutchins and Caroline Morrison resigning as planned. Emma Brooks has been appointed as partnership liaison, responsible for coordinating between the two organizations. Dennis Brooks will continue as construction director, but with revised priorities aligned to new mission. Ryan Brooks is taking an extended leave to, in his words, figure out what he actually believes versus what he was taught to believe. Paperwork will be finalized within 2 weeks. Helen would be proud of what you've built, and what you've inspired others to build alongside you. I read it 3 times, letting the reality settle. They'd done it. The family had actually chosen transformation over destruction, had accepted the opportunity to become people who built for communities instead of extracting from them. I stood by my window, looking out over Pilsen as evening settled into night. My grandmother's letter was in my bag, the words committed to memory. Legacy isn't what we accumulate, it's what we choose to see in each other, and what we do with that vision. She'd seen something in me that my family had missed, had recognized that choosing integrity over affluence wasn't weakness, but strength. And now that vision was expanding through the partnership with Brooks Development, through Emma's transformation, through Uncle Dennis's redirected expertise. I pulled out my laptop and began drafting plans for Lambert Holdings' next phase. 3 properties we were negotiating to acquire, all in neighborhoods facing gentrification pressure, partnerships with 5 additional community organizations, expanding our network of services, a job training program that would employ residents from our properties in building maintenance and management. The work was enormous, the responsibility daunting, but I wasn't facing it alone anymore. Emma would help coordinate with Brooks' development. Uncle Dennis would ensure quality and affordable housing projects. Even Victoria, however reluctantly, would lend her business acumen to making mission-driven development sustainable. The key still sat on my counter, brass catching the lamplight. It had opened doors I'd never imagined walking through, had revealed truths that transformed everything. But more than that, it had unlocked possibility. The chance to build something meaningful, to serve communities that needed support, to prove that wealth directed toward purpose could actually reshape how resources move through the world. That was inheritance. That was legacy. That was love made manifest in practical action, in properties preserved and families housed and neighborhoods stabilized. My grandmother had given me the tools, the resources, the foundation. Now the work of building was mine. Ours, belonging to everyone willing to measure success by lives improved rather than returns generated. I worked late into the night, creating spreadsheets that translated vision into actionable steps, developing timelines for property acquisitions, mapping out partnership structures with community organizations. And for the first time since that while reading, I felt completely certain about the path forward, not because it would be easy, but because it was right. My grandmother had seen that certainty in me years ago, had recognized someone willing to choose purpose over profit even when it cost everything, and she'd built her final legacy around honoring that choice, around proving that staying true to yourself was the only thing that actually created lasting change. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.